Okay, so let's just finish up by talking a little bit about Natan Sharansky. And by the way, we've just now begun to dig deeper, and I'll credit you, Greg. You were always focused on Ron Dermer, and you would keep pointing out to me in my through my thick skull. They would not quite resonate with me in the same way that Michael Ledeen, being Michael Flynn's co-author of The Field of Fight during the 2016 election season, that you kept pointing out to me that Natan Sharansky's co-author in his key post 9/11 book, The Case for Democracy or something like that, which was, recognized, I think published in 2004 and recognized as highly influential in maybe the thinking, but definitely in the public relations and communications strategies of the George W. Bush White House, a White House at war, in Iraq as a justification for what we probably should call the clean break wars and reshaping the Middle East and creating democratic forces that will then spread like a positive virus or something like that. And that Dermer, who, by the way, is called Netanyahu's brain, right? And it's, the kind of people that call like Dugin Putin's brain, or Rove, right? Wasn't Rove called George Bush's brain, or,
Yeah.
those kinds of things. The Dermer is recognized as Netanyahu's brain, and he's the co-author of Sharansky, who, by the way, the more and more I actually encounter Sharansky on these digital spaces, I've encountered him on these Zoom calls where I've tried to call into question his role in the architectures of the clean break wars, but also the question of these Israeli Jewish Soviet refuseniks, writing a book about him, unmasking him, I think was the title of the book, by respected Israeli surgeon Yuli Nudelman, that Sharansky then sued over, and Nudelman actually had witnesses on his side who had actually been Soviet refuseniks, and some of them had had direct witness evidence. Now, I'm not sure if they witnessed it themselves or they knew the people who would witness it, in terms of Sharansky, when he was in a Soviet prison, appeared to actually be shacked up in the guardhouse. So calling into question whether Sharansky was actually a Soviet snitch rather than a political prisoner, and ultimately maybe some kind of Soviet police agent of some sort. So just in my encounter with Sharansky, in terms of his written work, he almost always has a co-author too. Even when he wrote the article about the unjewing and this is mainly about the Zionism issue, Jews who don't, either non-Zionist, post-Zionist, anti-Zionist, they're not real Jews, right? So this whole weaponized IHRA definition is not just for the Gentiles. It's also to make sure to keep the un-Jews in line too, in terms of the definition of what it means to be a Jew. I've just found that Sharansky is sort of a dim. He's a dim bulb. There's not a lot going on there intellectually. Now, I know he's smart in certain ways, like he's good at chess. He's good politically. I'm sure he's read some things, but in terms of actually like intellectual capacity, I don't see a lot there. And so that then began to make me think that, that you pointing out that Dermer is the co-author for this key book, and then Dermer being seen as what Frank Luntz, who was his professor at Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania, called his brightest student,
I
Greg, or
think
something
so. I
like that?
think, yeah, I think that's what he referred to him as. Yeah. And by the way, Ron Dermer chose to go to Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School, after reading The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump. That was right in his Wikipedia profile, as Dermer cited that at a reunion dinner as his reason for going to the Wharton Business School at Penn. So.
Out of control. And of course, there's another one who seems to always have a co-author, right? The co-author of Art of the Deal by Donald Trump, Tony Schwartz, actually ended up whistleblowing on his ass, too. So this is a
Yeah.
sort of interesting
And
history here.
And in the book, I believe it was it was it in "Beep My Story" where Benjamin Netanyahu? I think I don't know. I think he mentioned Ron Dermer as Big Dermer would help sell Trump on certain policies as far as Israel Palestine goes by making golf analogies. Like if I this think of this as a 25-foot. Think of this as a 25-foot putt, or think of this. So it's just, it's just and you could see that. But Dermer is a very interesting guy behind the shadows. I mean,
Yeah.
he went to Penn and to Oxford, and he was a student of Frank Luntz's, and then he got involved in Israeli politics with Sharansky in the late '90s, '96, which was the year Netanyahu became prime minister, and then was introduced to Benjamin Netanyahu via Sharansky, and he immediately becomes like this right hand man of sorts to Netanyahu.
And it looks like he was introduced to Sharansky by this key and not very well known, actually Oxford, it looks like, oriented power player. That we'll get into all of that later. And then one other thing we're looking at in terms of Dermer, and obviously his key role in terms of Natan Sharansky, the great mind of the new anti-Semitism and of the wars for democracy and all of that kind of stuff, is the actual family history there, the Dermers, right? And so they are Miami power players before Dermer became, relinquished his American citizenship and went to Israel. By the way, right as you were pointing out, just right in with Netanyahu. I think he comes in 1996 as Netanyahu's brought in by the Arthur Finkelstein network, of who Frank Luntz is a key Finky kid. And so does that mean Dermer is like a second generation Finky kid? It seems so, right? And that's how he's then. So there probably is a relationship even directly between Arthur Finkelstein, and Ron Dermer in terms of that 1996 bringing Netanyahu into power. But the background of the family, the Dermer family, seems to coincide with this question of mob activity. Miami, Florida, obviously. Meyer Lansky, where does Meyer Lansky end up after actually multiple countries around the world would not take his $1 million in exchange for giving him asylum of some sort? Even the Israelis were a little bit uncomfortable around Sharansky. Meyer Lansky. And so Meyer Lansky ends up in Miami while the Dermers move down from New York City sometime, I think, in the 60s. And then the father of Ron Dermer, Jay Dermer, becomes the mayor of Miami. And by the way, Ron Dermer helped his brother become a 2-time mayor of Miami. And so there are some questions here in terms of gambling, mob money, the Meyer Lansky syndicate, the Miami connection here in terms of the actual root of Ron Dermer.
Definitely. And it's interesting that in the early days of the Trump administration, it was David Friedman who got all the attention as the ambassador to Israel, like, this hard line settlement hawk, and Trump is putting somebody who's not going to be an honest, like, broker as far as the Middle East goes, as far as Israel Palestine goes. I think that was accurate, of course. I think pretty important and accurate person to focus on in that regard, and his own connections like the Trump organization and all this. But Ron Dermer very, very much flew under the radar, like in this crucial role as like this American-born, South Florida-born, ultimately gives up his American citizenship in order to serve in Israel and the Israeli government, and then is the ambassador to Israel's ambassador to the U.S. during the contentious final years of Obama on throughout the Trump administration, and he very much flew under the radar in comparison to other people who got far more attention than he did. But I think Dermer is a very just based on some of this and then other things as well. That we'll share in some, we'll post a couple articles. Dermer is a very important person, I think, to understand. And then one last thing I'll say about Dermer is that go back to the an article that we covered on air several years back, Trump's New World Order, written in the New Yorker by Adam Entis in 2018, and it was the scene was the inauguration of Trump, and someone pointed to Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, said, "You're the most important ambassador here today." Kislyak smiles and points at Ron Dermer and says, "No, he's the most important ambassador
Mhm.
today."
Very good, Greg. I gotta hand it to you for staying on the Dermer beat over all these years. Crucial character, and you're
I've
right.
just
He
noticed
went,
he's around.
and he what he did. He flew under the radar way more than he should have in terms of how crucial a player he is in terms of the timing of all this. He was crucial to Netanyahu's storming of the Capitol in 2015.
Yes.
The Netanyahu and Dermer even, I think, lay out as like this key moment in terms of what ultimately become the Abraham Accords. That the key, mainly Emirati and Saudi leadership will reach out to Netanyahu after they see the way that he confronted Obama over the quote unquote Iran threat and all of that. And as we pointed out before, in terms of our analysis of the 11/9 operation and of Netanyahu's autobiography, that what's unsaid by Netanyahu, and now I would say add on Dermer, is that it was also the hatching of the logistics of the actual 11/9 operation to back and install Trump into the White House that very likely is launched after the storming of the Capitol by Netanyahu, that Dermer played a key role in terms of the communications over and the logistics and all of that. And then after that is when you then see the Red Sea yacht conspiracy that really is the launching of at the very least, of the Middle Eastern component of the 11/9 operation to install Trump, and I would say then create the entire political destabilizing, really political clean break program for the American body politic and beyond that we've seen since then. So Dermer, key figure, not only for Netanyahu but also for Sharansky. And so I just want to finish up by pointing out that Sharansky, the reason why, I see Sharansky was the was the most hypocritical and at least intellectually coherent of basically all of the voices of all of the neo-Parushim voices on X yesterday with Elon Musk, was because he comes in by saying, I am a Soviet dissident. I was a Soviet Jewish dissident, and I saw the way that they tried to restrict free speech of Jews and religious expression, and all of that. So I understand free speech. But then he immediately transitions into, I also understand how the Soviet regime at the time was also had its own anti-Semitic propaganda that it was pushing, and so we need to figure out how to reckon with the idea that what I've seen is that most of the time, much of the time, people's anti-Zionism is really anti-Semitism. We need to put these protocols in place for people to be to understand that. So it's obviously intellectually coherent, because what I think he's really saying is that the elements of the U.S. civil society in this case, and the U.S. government really doesn't really have the freedom of speech that we all do, including government has freedom of speech, right? And in terms of questions around not operationalizing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Although it's been acknowledged, it's not been operationalized by the U.S. government recently. So there's something there where he's basically, equating the Soviet Union's, sort of Stalinist anti-Semitic propaganda with the, just sort of like, a little bit of, U.S. civil society and U.S. government pushback around Zionist control of our public policy and public discourse. And so there's something here where he immediately goes into, how are we going to really sort of, police civil society speech around equating Zionism and anti-Semitism, and he's comparing it to Soviet state propaganda of some sort. So there's just an incoherence. He's flipping. The logic does not hold at all. And I don't even think he cares about whether it holds. He moves so quickly. It's just a talking point that he's trying to establish his credentials, which is why I think it's very important to understand who Sharansky actually is in the background and the questions of what I would call established Soviet Jewish Israeli dissidents who seem to have evidence against Sharansky being an actual authentic dissident rather than a long-term Soviet police snitch at the very least, and maybe something more like some kind of agent over time. And so, if Sharansky had his way, I'm sure he would have liked to have shut down Jewish American journalist of conscience Robert Friedman, especially his book Red Mafia, about that deals with Sharansky's ties to Russian organized crime and how that was brought in when Sharansky got into highest levels of Israeli politics, and how Sharansky teamed up with Netanyahu and brought on all this Russian organized crime money into their politics and all of that. So I'm sure Sharansky would have loved if he'd been able to shut down Robert Freeman's books. But what he was able to do was use the Israeli civil courts to really shut down his own Israeli, people who were already there in Israel before he became an Israeli citizen, who were calling out the actual background there of Sharansky. That was in the late '90s, I think. So Sharansky is a anti-free speech. He's definitely anti-core political free speech kind of character. But then he slipped immediately into the Durban conference, which, as we pointed out, Greg, when we did our analysis of the Daily Wire's trip to Jerusalem with Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, that the speaker who introduced the conversation was really honed in on the threat of the Durban conference. Right. So there's something very, very big there. As you pointed out, it's right. It's, there's a lot of talk of like the WTO protests. Of course, Naomi Klein being a crucial voice in terms of anti-globalization, especially from a left critical perspective in that way. But the other side of it, in terms of you're thinking more core political life, was the Durban conference, and obviously the question of Zionism and speech around Zionism being policed intensely, which is what they obviously wanted to do.